Good morning, Heather Exner-Pirot. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, great to be here.
For the listener, you are the Director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a Special Advisor to the Business Council of Canada, as well as a Research Advisor to the Indigenous Resource Network.
Yeah, that's me.
I think.
Yes.
But for the listener, what are those institutions?
Yeah, great question. So the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a think tank. Our little joke is if you're not thinking, you're tanking. But usually it's kind of like academic quality, but more policy-oriented work. And our think tank in particular, it's based in Ottawa. I'm the only one based in Calgary, but kind of run the gamut of federal policy and try to make bad policy, difficult in Canada, try to make better policy possible. And the Business Council of Canada is an association of, I think, just under 200 of the CEOs, large cap Canadian companies across all sectors, but lots of the energy and mining CEOs will be members of that. And finally, the Indigenous Resource Network is just a small Indigenous nonprofit, but represents businesses and workers in the resource sector and is generally pro-development, but with an Indigenous kind of aspect to it.
So they're nonprofits funded by industry, I think.
Well, yeah, certainly the first two are. Macdonald-Laurier gets some of its money from foundations, some from industry, some from other donors. But as a point of pride, we don't take any money from the federal government since it's our job to critique it.
So the idea is to kind of influence policy in the direction that the institution aligns with, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so that's where you fit in, is your ideas and your contributions.
Yeah, exactly. Try to provide some thought leadership on energy and natural resources and environment policy.
Which you're good at. You seem to hit on all the ideas and issues in the public sphere. Every time I see your posts, they just seem to hit right on the spot on. So congrats.
Yeah, well, thanks. Well, it's been good timing. We created this energy program. Before it was just domestic, foreign, Indigenous. And kind of post-Ukraine, there was so much demand for energy security, commodities analysis, all those things is becoming more important in Canada, again, with the commodity cycle. So they created this program and I became the director of it in 2023. And obviously people have just become more attuned to what's happening in the energy sector since then.
To go back in time a little bit. Originally from Calgary?
I'm originally from Saskatchewan. Yeah, so I'm a Saskatchewan girl. I still have my 306 phone number. And I did my PhD at University of Calgary, and we've lived in Medicine Hat. So we've gone back and forth from Alberta and Saskatchewan a few times, but now I've been settled in Calgary since 2019.
And full-on political science degree at U of C, I think, PhD in 2011, was it?
Correct, yeah.
So how did you evolve into energy policy? What was your, PhD on at the time?
Yeah, great question, because I'm sure I have a different trajectory than most of your listeners or indeed most human beings. But my PhD at the time was really on Arctic development and security. And if people remember, that was at the height. I graduated in 2011. So that was the height of the last commodity cycle. So I was very much watching, and writing, and I had to, change my thesis a few times to adjust to all the goings on. That was when there was, race for the Arctic, travel for the Arctic. The Russians had planted a titanium flag at the North Pole. And importantly, oil hit $147 a barrel. And that was in 2008. And so that was certainly a time where there was geopolitical interest had grown in the Arctic. And it was obviously very closely tied to the commodity cycle. And so I was writing and thinking about that and energy security in that way. And then, of course, the commodity cycle busted. And so I was also, a close watcher of what happens when the commodity cycle busted. And obviously that had, very poor development impacts in the Arctic. So my next job was at something called the International Center for Northern Governance and Development. And that more focused on Northern, which was always Indigenous development. And that was always resource development, actually. And so, I feel like through my, career or my university studies, no one had ever said, industry and Indigenous relations can be good or there can be benefits. It always pictured as very adversarial. But what I was seeing was some very good companies doing some very good work with Indigenous nations. And I really started to focus on the industry Indigenous angle and did a lot of work for some Indigenous groups on C69, C48, the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, things like that. But got me closer to industry, especially in Western Canada, and kind of just evolved from there.
So when you were younger, did you think to yourself you were interested in politics and policy? And what was your path into the undergrad?
Yeah, so it was more like, oh, I like to travel. Maybe someone would pay me to travel one day. And I always joke, if in the 90s, you're, a young white, liberal girl like me, today you'd go into climate change studies, but back in my day, it was international development. So, I did study abroads and I did internships in Geneva. And I liked all that. But but again, coming back to Canada, what was important in Canada on these topics? It was, the Arctic, it was commodities, it was resources, it was energy, it was oil and gas. And so it was that aspect of geopolitics or of international development that I guess attracted me, but trying to find, a Canadian aspect to it.
So in your 20s, you were kind of thinking politics might be something you're interested in, and you just started to become more interested as you went along?
Yeah. And I'll say, so, and I guess kind of the transition point was when I was doing more work for Indigenous groups in 2019 on C-69 and C-48, which people would know as the No More Pipelines Bill and the Tanker Moratorium Act. When I was in Saskatchewan in that last commodity cycle, it was, a lot of Indigenous groups. It was, the work that I was doing was trying to help them get into supply chains, get into procurement, make connections with mining sector. And that was the same on oil and gas. And it was the Wet'suwet'en blockades on the Coastal Gas Link that I was joking, radicalized me, where I couldn't believe what I was seeing in the media and with politicians of either villainizing pro-development Indigenous groups, that they're greedy or they're sellouts or they don't care about the land, or just ignoring them altogether, that the only Indigenous voices that mattered or that were being platformed were ones that were against development. And I'm seeing a little bit of that today. And I had, been working with Indigenous groups trying to get them, to speak out or write op-eds or, do Senate committee hearings, all those things, helping on the policy side. And eventually I did think, if I expect them to stick their neck out and talk about these things, I should be willing to do that too. And that's where I started to be more active writing and doing more of a think tank role.
So at the end of your undergrad, what were you thinking then? Like as you went into your master's and whatnot, what was the direction?
So my undergrad was in international studies. And then I did a study abroad in Guatemala with that. And when my professor knew someone at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, and they had a partnership with Chile. So there was money. No one in Newfoundland, I guess, wanted to take this money and go live in Chile for 4 months, but I sure did. So I did my master's in political science there, and I kind of did it on the southern circumpolar in the south of Chile, and some Indigenous communities there. And it was about development. It was like, how are they improving their material well-being? How are they getting out of poverty? And I guess that's always stuck with me, that I do care about economic development the most. And I have been very frustrated with how many of our policies have just not seemed to care about economic growth and who gets harmed by that, and how we become a weaker and a poorer country when that conversation has become so imbalanced. And so always a strong advocate for economic growth in all of its forms.
So you did that and you came back to Calgary and started your master's then?
I did. What did I think before? So I started my master's, went to Chile for my research, and then I got an internship in Geneva. So I lived in Geneva for 8 months. And that was also very interesting to kind of see, it's all fine and good for kind of the lefties and the hippies and the progressives and the environmental NGOs to have their say. But at the end of the day, it was states that had power, and it was states that made decisions. So I think that was also, defining for me to think about, where does power lie and how do people get power, and how could that, and that's how decisions get made. And that's where influence comes from. So a front seat to that. And then I came home. And I started my PhD at the University of Calgary. Oh, I had been working at the U of S at something called University of the Arctic after my internship. And it was a consortium of universities, but very much focused on kind of international collaboration on Arctic issues. And my husband got a job in Alberta. And so I was like, well, I guess I'll go do my PhD at the U of C. And there was someone here, Rob Hubert, who is kind of the godfather of Arctic studies, we call him. And I studied under him.
I grew up ski racing, so we used to go down to Santiago in the summer to ski.
Yeah.
So it was an eye-opener in terms of the economic development outside of that city. And maybe like you saw gives you a perspective on the importance of, well, I guess how good we have it here and why developing the economy is a good thing.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I think if, people who have traveled in developing countries don't take electricity for granted, don't take energy for granted, don't become complacent about the power and the importance that those things have in people's lives.
You live the city there, and I remember it just like stark. There was like tense and real drastic difference. So I'm sure, as you saw, that too.
And most rural and remote areas, they tend to be less developed compared to urban areas. And if you're in a rural or remote area, almost anywhere in the world, your best opportunity for economic development is almost always going to be resource development.
Right.
And so I also saw that, I think, kind of two tiers of people in urban areas living a good life, on the benefit of somebody's saying to people in rural areas, what you do isn't important, or it's backwards, or it's, 20th, 19th century stuff. You need to develop like we have. And that, and there's also, that also didn't sit well with me for to try to dictate to the rural regions of the world that they should be different, or they should be like you and not have their own path.
This episode is brought to you by Bunch Projects. Bunch is a construction-led engineering and EPC partner supporting Western Canada's energy industry for more than 45 years. Bunch combines practical field-driven engineering with data-driven planning to improve predictability and support cost certainty. From well pads and compressor stations to gas plants and energy development, Bunch focuses on construction, clear communication, and consistent results. Bunch construction-led engineering is built on trusted partnerships and proven performance. Learn more at bunch.ca.
So when did you start to develop your political perspective, and how would you characterize it now? Do you avoid labels, or small c conservative? What would you say?
Yeah, so Macdonald-Laurier Institute is definitely small c conservative, so fiscal conservative. But we are nonpartisan. We try to be nonpartisan. I've never held a party membership with any party in my life, and so I try hard just to be analytical. But I would say I'm a pragmatic person. That I think comes from growing up in Saskatchewan.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have all your family members. If I go home at Christmas and talk about these things, what is my aunt, on the farm in Indian Head going to think of my hoity-toity? So always trying to think what would resonate with people, or what doesn't sound pretentious, or what actually matters to people. And there's a lot of academic discourse that I don't think matters a lot to a lot of people. And I guess that was also, part of the reaction of where I got in my work, is trying to, attract to the policy side of things that can, actually try to improve, things for Canadians.
And so when did you realize that you wanted to influence how policies or decisions are made instead of just studying them? When did you recognize the difference?
Well, these are such great questions. And I think it was working. So when I was, after my master's, after my PhD, I went back to the University of Saskatchewan at a research center there, working with a lot of Indigenous groups, and sat on the board, helped found something called the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network. Like I say, a lot of our work was about trying to get Indigenous groups, trying to improve. So you say, don't sit back and be on welfare. Well, then help them develop, help them get into the market, make it easier for them, because there are a lot of barriers even to this day. And that was, I guess, the first taste of, what policies could we do to help them get into, to assist them, or remove the barriers that we've already put in place in front of them to, participate to the extent that they want in the market economy. And then just doing a lot of Indigenous advocacy. And again, seeing so much advocacy on the other side, or so much work on the other side of kind of putting Indigenous peoples in a box of this is the right way that we white people think that you should act, or that is celebrated in the media. And in actual fact, and the people that I worked with and knew, they were proud of the work they did in the resource sector. They were proud if they got a trade. They were proud if they created a business. They were proud if they created jobs in their community. And I couldn't tolerate people from the outside putting boundaries around them or roadblocks in their way of doing the things for their communities. And like I say, there was a lot of that in the 2010s. I also studied the Arctic. It was also happening in the Arctic at the time. Greenpeace had a big campaign, Save the Arctic. They did not, and it was, Inupiat in Alaska that wanted to develop oil reserves in their territories.
Yeah.
They owned the land there in Alaska, and Greenpeace had a big, strategy to try to get them to stop. And I just thought, like, who are you to tell these communities what they can and cannot do? And that extended, then it just extended that, I was working for a think tank primarily on these Indigenous industry relations. But after Russia invaded Ukraine, the whole world's attention kind of turned back to energy security. And my PhD had been in international relations. So there's a lot of geopolitics, a lot of theory, and it's all being played out. And there's so much of oil, that just gets played out in kind of a very high, security, high power geopolitical way. And I saw it playing out again. And I also couldn't tolerate, that Canada was just becoming poorer and weaker. That we were shooting ourselves in the foot with so many of these policies. And MLI was a very good platform, very willing to be provocative, very willing to be the first to say something, not shy at all about ruffling feathers in kind of the establishment. And so that was a great home for me to say what I really thought.
The point is that it's a big difference between studying policy and academic theory and actual implementation of the policy and coming up with op-eds and trying to influence concrete actions.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think the best way to do that is? Is it just where you're at now? Is it doing podcasts and well-written articles? How do you think about the best way to implement good policies that actually make a difference?
Well, great question. And so what we try to do at MLI, and I think most think tanks, and I've done some work with other think tanks, is create the public environment that is accepting of new ideas. So if anyone's heard of the concept of the Overton window, is to make, a concept that is unpopular into a concept, where there's space to talk about it, where it becomes more acceptable. It's not unacceptable absolutely to touch it, to we can have a discussion about it, to it becomes mainstream, to it becomes popular. And once an idea is popular, then politicians, parties will want to compete to absorb that popular position. And as an example, I'll just point to pipelines, that in the last 10 years, where even oil and gas, but in particular pipelines were, in certain circles,
it shifted.
Yeah. And that now it's a 70-30 issue. I guess that is what a think tank wants to do is the policy preferences that we believe in based on our analysis and expertise and experience of moving it to, the 70-30, the strong side of the 70-30 issue, such that it becomes difficult for politicians not to advance it, such that it becomes, that there's a penalty to sit on the sidelines of it. And so that's what we try to do is just provide the information. And in any way, we think about very different audiences. I think for a think tank, maybe, you're doing, papers and you're doing podcasts and you're doing op-eds, are trying to reach different audiences at different levels. Some people only want to read 700 words. Some people only want to read a tweet. But at some level, I need that 25-page paper with all the data, with all the references, with all the thought to back up that tweet and that op-ed and that podcast. And so we're mindful of kind of running that whole gamut.
And at what point, you kind of talked about it, but did you realize that it was important to take your ideas and make them actionable? One thing I didn't really like about doing a minor in political science is that you could just read the books and come out with the same, I guess, ideas, and that there was a lot of theory involved. But when did you realize that it was important to have actions at the end of it all?
Yeah, it was again with, Northern Gateway and Coastal GasLink, and how organized the environmental NGOs were, and occupying all of the space. And I think it's true that the oil and gas sector was shy, or there was not public appetite. They had been vilified. And a lot of people just kept their head down. Or maybe there was a thought that, I don't care what, the activists say or the NGOs, the business is, it's a $100+ billion business, it's too big to fail. We can just stand by and let this noise kind of go around. But obviously the noise had an impact.
Yes.
And we left a vacuum. And it was painful for me to see this on the Indigenous side, that other people were were preoccupying the Indigenous voices, or determining what they were, or creating what would the media report about Indigenous peoples was a very narrow band, and I just could not. I couldn't tolerate that anymore, leaving that vacuum open for only one side of the story, only one narrative, to fill social media, to fill media pages, to be influential in politicians. And it was about, and it was easy because there was so little fighting back. It was not easy to poke holes in those arguments because many of them were, deeply flawed. And so it was just such an easy space to grow into and expand of advocating for Canadian energy and resources.
Yeah.
And because I feel like we have the facts on our side.
Yeah. Facts are great, but how do you measure the influence in the space? Like when you're trying to persuade people and shift public opinion, is it just one day you wake up and there's a 70-30 pull on the approval pipelines? How do you get feedback and results?
I mean,
how do you measure it?
Yeah, I mean, that's what your donors will ask you that all the time. And I think it's hard in policy. It's not, and this is something that's so different from a business, where you can measure the barrels that you produced or the money that you brought in.
It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just hard to measure.
But I'm a qualitative social scientist. So I actually, so we have some methods of measuring. I mean, some of it is, there are metrics, of readers or committee appearances. Our think tank is the most cited in the Hansard in Parliament. So that's a proxy for saying you're influential to the Canadian government. Right. But as these last 2 years have gone by, there's quite a few policies that, where I feel like I was an early thought leader on them, wrote about it earlier, talked about it more, that have become policy. And even some, I would say, from the Carney government, where you can see some of our influence or words. And then it's hard to me to, criticize everything the Carney government does when I feel like, to some extent, they're listening to some of the things that my think tank or people in my network would be saying. Yeah. So it is at the point, I think, of the commodity cycle and the political cycle where these ideas are resonating. And there are some policymakers that are open to, some of these arguments and some of these recommendations.
So you have political opinions, and I guess the structure, small c conservative would be how you define your beliefs, but how do you balance that with what's popular? Do you just stick with ideas and issues that you think are what is right? How do you make sure you're not blending into what the populist sentiment is at the day, to make sure you're actually leading with what your North Star is?
Yeah. I mean, it's very easy to do that at Macdonald-Laurier Institute because our founder,
Chasing trends.
Yeah. It's a very principled organization. And for the last 10 years, we were kind of on the unpopular side. And especially for me, coming from, a university background, academic background, I still go to my Arctic studies conferences, where climate change and those kinds of things that play a very big role and are very influential. Often, maybe I am the black sheep or the skunk at the garden party at some of those things, but by and large, but I don't work at a university and I don't work for government, and I have the privilege of a platform where my job is to say what I think is the right thing. And that has always actually rewarded me a great deal, actually, to be able to say the things that we think is right. And so I don't have those constraints. And I think I have even fewer constraints than a tenured professor at a university that has to get a grant, that has to publish a paper. I think I have even fewer of those constraints. So it's very easy for me to just be able to say what I think. But at the same time, I mean, you do have to be credible. It can't just be your opinions that you're spouting out. There's an expectation that there's some thinking and some expertise. And so it's important to us that we justify what the policy recommendations we're making. And it's not because you're on, a blue color or a red color, but it's because so many, years and studies of evidence point to a logical, recommendation at the end of it.
Yeah. It takes courage to put your name on an op-ed. Do you remember your first op-ed and hitting publish?
I mean, it really does. And that's why, because I started out supporting in the writing for Indigenous voices. And again, people that I would, support as they, they, tell me what they want to write about. I'd kind of put it in a way that, a Globe and Mail might be willing to publish it, or that the Senate could hear it. And they had targets on their back, and they had to put themselves out there. And it's a little easier now, but I promise you in 2018, it was not easy to be the Indigenous chief or the business leader to go out and say, I like pipelines. And it's not that easy today in Northwest BC either to be that person.
Yeah.
And so I appreciated the personal courage and the risk that so many of the handful of Indigenous leaders, and I'll name Chris Sankey, JP Gladue, Stephen Buffalo, Chief Roy Fox, Karen Ogan, the Chief Crystal Smith from the Haisla, people that came out early and took personal risk to say what they thought was best for their community. They did it because they thought they were saying what was best for their community. And I did feel like I can't keep asking, people to take personal risk and not take it myself. But now I don't really get a lot of bad, backlash on social media. Even I don't get mean emails almost ever. Like once a year, maybe I might get one email. So it is not as toxic as maybe you might expect or think. And mostly I get people saying, yeah, I thought that too. Thanks for saying it.
It's one thing to be academically brilliant or the best student around, but how much do you think courage influences to opinions and the public realm? Just be willing to put your opinion out there.
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot because it is strange that there's so few people like me on the pro-energy side in Canada, or even knowledgeable about the business side, curious, I will say, because I'm not in business, curious about the business side and of market dynamics and of the economics of it in the Canadian Academy, in universities.
Yeah.
And so again, it was almost a vacuum for MOI and for myself to come out. There's a handful of other think tanks that do that work, but very few in universities. In Canada, we're the world's third largest exporter of oil. Yeah, exactly. And there's not a little bit of our, public funding for research in universities that comes from the resource sector. And so you do have to ask, why is it so hard, or why has there been such a dearth of political scientists and economists and sociologists and social scientists in Canadian universities to be knowledgeable about the business of resource development and of the policy for it? And I think part of it is just that it is true, and I saw it, and I was, that universities do have a particular ideological bias today in 2025. And this is founded, MLI has done the research, but it's founded in research. And that maybe people like me who do consider themselves small C conservative, just want smaller government, more private sector, don't feel at home in a Canadian university to the same extent anymore.
Yeah. In other words, you're rare.
I think I am rare, and it is quizzical. And I don't think it's the benefit of the country that there are so few social scientists interested in resource development in Canada, providing that input into policy.
So, which is where you find yourself today. Luckily, there are institutes that you can align with. And I guess the critic would say you're influenced by your financial incentives through those institutions. But what would your response be to that?
Well, I wouldn't work for a Canadian think tank if I was after the money. And it's not the place where I make, a ton of money. Anyway, so no, that is not this. You ask my husband if he thinks I'm maximizing my market potential here by working for a nonprofit.
Right.
So that would be my answer. But again, I guess that doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all.
Right. How about energy nowadays? Maybe a couple issues. I've read a bunch of your op-eds, but maybe a few of the ones that seem to be top of mind. The first one being the Canada-Alberta MOU. Maybe for the listener, what is the Canada-Alberta MOU, and why is it important? Why has it been important the last few months?
Yeah, well, I'm very positive on the MOU. So Carney was elected again, where in the wake of Trump tariffs and kind of our productivity, economic crisis, affordability crisis that people are going through, and there was public appetite. Trudeau was extremely unpopular. His policies were very unpopular. And so there was very strong appetite for a different direction. And even though Carney won as a Liberal, if you look at the Liberal platform, there wasn't a lot on climate in that platform. They didn't sell themselves on the climate aspect. He did sell himself as creating an energy superpower. And I never would have anticipated, a year ago that a Liberal government, Liberal leaders, Christopher Lynn did it too, would be selling themselves as we'll help Canada build into an energy superpower. But again, I think they were following public opinion rather than leading it. And so they did come into an environment where, it is a dramatic flex point for Canada, inflection with the United States. And he's saying that we do want to be the fastest growing country in the G7, and we do want to diversify our exports. We do want to double non-US exports, and we do want to be an energy superpower. And there's only so many paths to get to those particular goals. And I think Carney I think the next election will be about the economy. It won't be about the United States anymore. And I think Carney was elected on the idea that he is, a steady hand at the tiller. He does have competency on the financial side. And if he can't deliver on the economic side, that will strike at the heart of what people thought that they were voting for Carney in the first place, which is to say that there was an environment in which Ottawa, for the first time in a long time, would have been much more amenable to Alberta's demands than before. So what the MOU actually did, and Danielle Smith has talked about the 9 bad laws for a long time, brilliant communications, because it's so crystal clear what it was that we wanted changed. And if you ask me, they were nine bad laws. But what the MOU got rid of, a few minor political caveats, but I'm confident in, is getting rid of the emissions cap, number 1, and a carve out for the clean electricity regs, number 2. The 2 most important aspects of that MOU, if you ask me. And we've all obsessed over the Northwest Pipeline, and that will be important in a few years. But today, to get LNG facilities FID today, to fill the Trans Mountain expansion today, to fill the mainline expansion today, you needed to get rid of that emissions cap. No money was going to come to those projects with that in place. And then on the clean electricity regs, that was why we're having a shortage of electricity and why we couldn't attract the data center and AI money. And we all know, we talk about LNG and pipelines. The biggest capital outlay happening right now is in data centers and electricity generation. And we had 2 hands tied behind our back with the clean electricity regulations, which basically is a goal to have net zero electricity generation, which means that you can't build new natural gas-fired generation.
Yeah.
Which means in Alberta and Saskatchewan, you're left with nothing. And frankly, we're not building hardly any new hydro in this country either. So you can do renewables. They have intermittency problems, aren't there on your peak load day, or you could do natural gas generation. We have cheap natural gas. We're, a good jurisdiction, cooler, so many things that would make Alberta competitive on that the CER was taking away. And that was a surprise to me, but I think Carney must at least recognize, and there's enough elbows up people in Ottawa, that it's not in our interest to be dependent on the United States for all of our data and for all of our AI. And for that to change, we would have to build some up here. And that meant carving out that CER.
And so the critic would say the Liberals are just following public opinion, which is the opposite of what you've been doing the last few years with concrete policies that are based on principles. But what I'm curious is where that's coming from. Is it because Canada's going broke? Is it because we're being Trump talk being annexed? Or where do you think that opinion's coming from? Why has it shifted a little bit?
Well, a perfect storm of a wonderful storm.
It's a bunch of things.
It's all those things. So one thing, and this will be high conviction for me, is that it's the time of the commodity cycle where Canada has to make it easier to develop commodities.
Because we're broke?
Because the commodity cycle, there was a bust in 2014, and it was a lot easier for funds to say we're going to do ESG, or for Trudeau to say we need to diversify and think about coding, and we had to diversify away from oil and gas because the sector was bust and mining was bust, and they haven't provided good returns. They haven't been a great place for economic growth in so many years. And so it was just easier to have those opinions when energy was very cheap, when inflation was very low, right, when there was a surplus of minerals on the market. China was dumping them, at cheaper than we could produce here. There was no scarcity for those so many years, 2014 to 2020. And so you could have policies where you say, well, what else do we do? That wasn't the source of growth. But now in 2025, And since a little bit since COVID, where you start to say, geez, supply chain kind of matters.
Right.
You can't just get everything from China because it's the cheapest provider. Supply chain security matters a little bit. And then Russia invading Ukraine, which resulted not only in an energy shock, but a food shock and a political awareness that sustainability cannot be our top policy priority. It can't. That reliability and affordability and security of supply has to come first. And once you can sort all of that out, then you have the luxury of addressing the longer term sustainability issues. So it changed the public conversation. People were paying more for energy for the first time in a long time in 2022, and that created the opening. And then, the icing's on the cake. One is the Canadian economy has been moribund. And part of it is because of the climate policies and the way that they've restricted growth and the way they've restricted investment. And Canadians were starting to feel it in that post-COVID inflationary crunch but that objectively their purchasing power has gotten lower and it's harder to afford a house. And sometimes you can't buy everything at the grocery store that you would like to buy. You can't afford strawberries. You can't afford steak. So people feeling that crunch very much. And then add on top of that, the Trump threats and a sense that you can't take for granted that Canada will always be around and that everyone will always play nice. In fact, we need to have some strength ourselves, like geopolitical strength. And where do you turn to if you're Canada? What is your source of strength and influence in this world? It is absolutely oil, gas, and minerals and food. Absolutely. And so even now, as we're trying to bolster, as you're negotiating with the United States, what are our cards? 4.4 million barrels of oil that we send a day. That's a pretty fantastic card. Natural gas that they need to beat China in the AI race, all the potash, the fertilizer. Those are pretty great cards. And when we go to Europe and we go to Asia to bolster our alliances with others, what is the only thing they ask? Every time Carney goes abroad, what are they asking for? Oil, LNG, critical minerals, in some cases food, fertilizer. So it's apparent to everybody that the cards that Canada has to play are energy and resources. And in fact, they're tremendous cards. They're absolutely tremendous cards, especially now at this stage of the commodity cycle. We really can expand our trade relationships. We really can get richer and more powerful.
Yeah. One way it's been framed for me is that intellectual capital can walk across the border pretty easily. U.S. car manufacturers can take the jobs back pretty easily. But on the other hand, the Montney, oil sands, massive energy deposits aren't going anywhere. And it's something Canada has no matter what. I don't know if that's a good way to think about it.
I absolutely think that's a good way to think about it. And also think how important reliable, trustworthy trading partners have become for everyone. And it was even on your last one with Vern, what Asian partners are looking, Asian partners very much care about energy security because they are so dependent on imports and very much want redundancy and very much want reliability. And Canada has, we have our bickers internally, domestically, and I've had a lot of issues, but we do have the best reputation pretty much of any country abroad. And we are seen as a trustworthy player. And we do have the things that people need, just the basic raw materials for their civilization. And so if we can't make some kind of play out of this as Canada, again, in this time of the world and this time of the commodity cycle, that's an own goal. We have every advantage. I always say there's 200 countries that wish they had the problems that Canada had.
It's also easy to get cheap political points with slogans like elbows up, but the U.S. also really wants our products too. They're an incredible trading partner and with the largest consumer society there is on our border. It seems crazy not to want to trade with them as well.
I absolutely do. I think everyone in this town absolutely does. And I think that's also strategic. For all the distaste we have with the Trump administration, it is true that Canada was a laggard and not a reliable ally for the United States or NATO in the last few years, that we weren't contributing militarily to the alliance. We were spending the least of anyone. We were doing the least. And with all that we have here, there was a war in Russia. They're having an energy crisis. And what are we doing here in comfortable Canada? Nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
And so there was some truth to can you at least provide us with energy and minerals? That's the one thing you guys could do for us right now. So we can get off dependence of Russia and China, and you're not even willing to do that. And so Canada lost the moral high ground, I think, under Trudeau. And now we're trying to gain it back. And I think it is in everyone's interest. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you are, for the United States to be a benign hegemon and go back and lead the Western Alliance and move back to, a dominance of the liberal world order, instead of a multipolar world where China is just as influential, where OPEC, where Russia, hold more sway. And so we should want the United States to be strong and good. And it won't help us at all if they have expensive energy, and if they don't win the AI race with China, and if they don't have the materials that they need for the defense industrial supply chain. But at the same time, let's also be strong on our own 2 feet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's in our own interest to be a great trading partner with the United States.
Yes.
It's a win-win. It's not a zero sum, or it doesn't have to be.
No, it doesn't have to be. And I mean, but I just, because, we just take it so much for granted what we have in North America, that in Canada we are so safe. And anyway, so we do need some leverage against the United States. It's clear. I mean, if you're a realist, you would say that. But absolutely, we do have some leverage. I think they do need our oil, our minerals, our potash.
But they're willing to buy.
And they're willing to buy. And again, the Trump administration is one thing, but everyone has great relationships with states, with municipalities, with businesses, with people. The relationship is deeper than just Ottawa and Washington, D.C. And so I would say let's lean into those other relationships with our other American partners. And the American public is absolutely on side. It's like Canada, there's some polls at CNN. Yeah, we're like 30 points more popular with the United States than Trump is. The approval rating of Canada is, 70 or 80%. The approval rating of Trump is 40. So there's no reason to think that it's not possible to get on a better track with the American people.
And when an American buyer purchases Canadian energy, that's money into Canada, which is a good thing.
Yes.
These are all good things.
It's absolutely mutually beneficial. And that's why, and when you talk about, international relations and geopolitical interests and realism, it's really about interest. What is in your interest? And don't ever expect anyone to not act in their own interests. But I am certain it's in our mutual interest for the United States to buy our energy and for us to sell them our energy. And so I expect that will, despite some blips and blurps here, that will continue.
But on the other hand, in Alberta and out west, there are some critics of the Canada-Alberta MOU who would say that it's basically just a flimsy piece of paper being used to score political points on both sides. So how do you think about it that way? And when do we see actual results?
Well, I didn't, it wasn't great for scoring political points, actually. It cost Carney, a lot on his progressive base and in some tighter ridings in Montreal and in Quebec City and in Ottawa and Toronto. And it wasn't great for Danielle Smith on her right flank of the UCP either, who don't want to see any climate commitments, any industrial carbon pricing, no compromises there. So if you ask me, I think in the medium term it will be good politics, but it was mostly good policy. That MOU was about policy, not politics. And there were some compromises made on the Alberta side, yes. But guess what? The Liberals won the last federal election, and we're still in Canada. So to say that, you wanted nothing that the Liberals would want or that their base would want, well, that's not how politics work. They won the election. They are in government. You have to play ball with the government that's in power of the day. Yeah. But have we already had early wins? Absolutely. Like, if you ask me, getting rid of the emissions cap was a precondition to getting FID on siliciums and LNG Canada Phase 2, which I think we'll get. It was, I think, what allowed Enbridge and Trans Mountain to announce their expansions. It's allowing, even at $60 WTI or 58, people are still announcing more spending and incremental, some, modest production increases. And then on the CR, within, I think, a day, I think Capital Power was announcing, a data center deal. And since then, I think there's been 4 more data centers announced, and I think there'll be over $10 billion of gigawatts, of $1 billion of investments in generation, probably in the next quarter, certainly in the next 2 quarters. Like, the money is flooding in to Alberta natural gas generation right now. So for me, I'm just very bullish. Is there more that could be done? I think, if prices get better and if geopolitical, tensions get more, okay, then you'll have some more room for the federal government to go a little bit further. But for now, it's, after being punched in the face for 10 years, it feels so good to not be punched in the face anymore. And that MOU, I think politically costs Carney more in political capital than it costs Smith.
The other argument from Alberta is that's almost like Stockholm syndrome, like you just mentioned, where it's been so bad for 10 years that we get one little morsel that we're overjoyed and that we should be thanking Carney and the Liberal government like overnight. But in reality, this is just a small step. What do you think about that argument?
Well, to some extent, it's true. I'm very sympathetic, to these things, but the fact is, Alberta is a province in the Confederation of Canada, and we are governed by those laws. And if people want to make efforts to not be, part of that confederation, go ahead. It's not a 70-30 issue for separation yet.
Right.
It's the opposite. It's a 30, that's on the 30 side. And so do the work. And so if you're in the oil and gas sector, you're going to wait until we separate for things to get better? I don't think so. So just, this is, if you're pragmatic, this is very good in the short term. It is. And it's good in the medium term. Is it perfect? No. I never am a person that wants to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right. Another, I guess, concern is the pipeline issue. For the listener, someone might say, why don't you just build a pipeline to the East Coast or the West Coast and you should just be happy and things will be fine. But why have companies been unable to complete those projects, and why has it been an issue?
Well, I mean, that was the prevalent thinking in Ottawa at the time, and with Trudeau and with all of his base and lots of, I'll say the Laurentian elite, I don't mind saying that, I believe that they truly believed that demand for oil and gas was in, a fatal decline. And that they were saving us from ourselves, that there was no market for our product anyways. So none of the policies they imposed on us actually had material impact because it was all inevitable anyways. And that, the green economy was the future, and that's where we're going to grow. And I think it was divorce, I think, because I've seen this up close, there's a lot of academic thinking and non-governmental, nonprofit thinking, people who have never been in business, never had to get a contract, never had a customer, never had to make payroll, never had to have a shareholder meeting, that just never didn't understand the energy system, only thought of oil when they got gas in their car, only thought of electricity when they plugged their phone into the wall, making these decisions about our energy system.
Yeah.
And not open to the criticisms, accusations that you're a climate denialist, if you dare question. And as a result, terrible policy. We had 10 years of very bad, terrible policy that cost this economy a ton. And so on the pipeline, but you have to appreciate, so there's policies, the tanker ban, the Impact Assessment Act, so many other policies too at the permitting level, lots of Indigenous, decisions that just gave no clear path to how would you even, obtain consent or consult, no clarity on that added so many layers of barriers to the resource sector. And now we're unwinding that because it was not good for the country and people didn't like it. But at the same time, we did build Trans Mountain and we did build Coastal GasLink, and they both had majority Indigenous support, and they're both operating safely. And those were built in that era that I just described to you. Mm-hmm. And so you can't convince me that it's not going to be easier to build that Northwest Pipeline in 2026 than it was when we started building it in 2018.
Do you worry that in the case of pipelines or any of these projects, that when there's like a special project office, that it's almost communist Russia or communist China, there's a strange black box making decisions in Ottawa, and that maybe this isn't the best message to investors, and there should be clear rules and a set procedures for investors who want to make big decisions on pipelines?
Well, absolutely. So, if based on everything I know about governance, it is not the best governance. It is not the best policy to create a parallel, adjacent, politically led major projects office and pick and choose politically based on the admonitions of premiers and have to pepper a dot on the map for each regional jurisdiction in Canada. This is not a way to run a G7 economy.
Yeah.
And this is not a way to run a resource and energy sector the size of Canada's. And I would say, they'll do, their 10 or 15 projects under the MPO when there's, literally over 500 projects that have been proposed by the private sector in various stages of planning, looking for permits and approval in Canada. So that is absolutely not the approach I would take. But at the same time, if I'm just being generous, what did that do? It signaled to the investment community that Canada was changing, that Canada wants to build things. And at least on Siliciums and LNG Canada Phase 2, where there aren't other LNG, there isn't other domestic competition. It did signal, I would say, to Asian investors that these will not take 10 years. These will come faster. Now, the whole system should be reformed. And I fear very much that this will be an excuse to say, well, we did something.
Exactly.
And we did something. And that is absolutely not. But the MOU signaled some of the bigger changes of things I was actually looking for, that CEO letter of 96 CEOs, the things that they were asking for, those have been meaningfully addressed. You can't in good faith tell me that those asks that they had in the CEO letter have not been meaningfully addressed. And I will say this because it's fallen on the radar. Everyone hated C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, the No More Pipelines bill. What we asked for instead, and I've been writing about this and advocating, is not a lot of people in industry, including CAP, including the oil and gas sector, that said just repeal. Usually the word was reform. And why? Because no one wants to go through another situation of this polarization of not knowing what your Impact Assessment Act is in the federal government for 5 years while it's being debated politically. No one wanted that. There were ways that you could tweak it that would get rid of its worst impacts. And mostly it was get the federal government out as much as possible of all of our projects as you can. Most oil and gas, other than interprovincial pipelines, the federal government doesn't really need to touch any of what we do here in Alberta or with the mine. It really need a very light touch from the federal government for the things that are in their lane and their jurisdiction. They have done that. It was people don't appreciate. They've outlined 4 new collaboration agreements with Ontario, with New Brunswick, I think Nova Scotia, I think one more. Saskatchewan is probably going to be next, I think Manitoba, where they're making collaboration agreements to say very clearly, we will defer to you provinces on these non-renewable resources per the Constitution. There's a few areas of federal jurisdiction, fish, migratory birds, species at risk, some Indigenous lands, that's our jurisdiction. We have to be involved on that. But we will collaborate with you as best as possible, avoid redundancy, avoid duplication, make the pathway easier for projects. They have been doing that work for the last year. And so at some level, the bureaucracy, the political machinery has been getting the message. They don't want to be offside of Canadian public opinion either. And to say, yes, we can do it. Because you know why? If they are offside of political opinion, eventually there will be a conservative government. There was a real threat that the Impact Assessment Act or agency would just be vanished. And I think they know that. And I think a lot of those bureaucrats know that. And so they've been making a good effort to be more efficient. So they aren't that target.
Also, the idea that Alberta separation isn't necessarily a fringe issue anymore.
No, not at all. And I think, economically, you could easily make the case that Alberta would be better off as its own nation in the long term. And so, and that gave it leverage and power. Exactly. Don't tell me that MOU wasn't partly as a result of the fact that Alberta has other options. And that's absolutely true that Trump would recognize Alberta as a state immediately, which would probably not have been the case with Quebec when they had their referendum, in the 90s. So very different. So absolutely consideration, and I think that motivated Carney, but absolutely in the best interest of the country as a whole, if you ask me.
And so speaking of other options, what is the Asia Pacific route pipeline? What is that? mean in terms of building, and what is it? What is the pipeline?
Yeah, well, I'm bullish on the pipeline, so
For the listener, what?
yeah, so there was a Northern Gateway, and it's meant to get more bitumen from the oil sands in particular to Asian customers. And it had been routed before to end in Kitimat. It was approved by the National Energy Board. And then there was some dispute over whether they had done the duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous nations. And so some of that was overturned. But then Justin Trudeau just killed it anyways. On the same day as he approved Trans Mountain, he rejected Northern Gateway, and that was $1 billion flushed down the toilet, basically, for Enbridge. And a huge red flag to the international investment community to say that in Canada, there is no political resiliency to decisions. That in Canada, the pendulum may swing, and in 4 years, your project takes 8 years to build. Well, there's an election every 4 or 5 years, and you don't know what's going to happen to your project. And so investment fleet, there is a risk premium assigned to Canadian projects. Yeah. So that's obviously the situation. Not only did he kill Northern Gateway, but in that same year passed the Impact Assessment Act, which basically would allow the Minister of Environment, which, as we know, was Stephen Guilbeault for several years, McKenna before that, to veto any project that may impact our ability to meet the Paris Agreement, which means that there was no threshold given. Any project that would emit greenhouse gases could be vetoed. And me driving here emitted greenhouse gases. Yeah. There's not a project in the country that doesn't emit greenhouse gases, which wouldn't give the opportunity for the Minister of Environment to veto it. Who is going to invest in the planning of a project, a major project, especially oil and gas, which they hate, knowing that McKenna or Guilbeault can veto it at the end of the day? No one. And that's what happened. In fact, only 2 projects have been approved on the Impact Assessment Act since it was became law in 2019. And they put the oil tanker ban in. Yeah. And so just in case anyone, for some reason, thought that they could get around, the fact that, there's political vetoes, there's this horrible Impact Assessment Act, there's also going to be a law against shipping the oil out of that coast. So it was just, layers and layers that Trudeau and environmental community put in place to prevent this project from happening. So when people say, well, why isn't there a private proponent? Because layers and layers and layers of policy were in place to prevent a private proponent from ever being able to go, a CEO from ever going to their shareholders and their board and saying, we're going to allocate funding, we're going to put some money into this. But it's absolutely in Canada's interest and Alberta's interest to build this pipeline. And that's why Danielle Smith and the government of Alberta have said, we'll assume some of this risk. We're going to do some of this upfront work. We're going to do some of that early engagement with Indigenous communities. And it's a big win, if you ask me, in the MOU. To get Carney to agree, it's in black and white, that yes, there's a lot of conditions, but there is a pathway. There is a way to thread the needle. There are conditions under which the Carney government will approve this pipeline. And that was not the case under Trudeau.
But there's the one going now, the idea to go through the States. Is that the Pacific route? So that was the option that we have, maybe going south to a different market, I think is the idea, is that's been proposed, I think.
Is that what, there was... You mean with Danielle Smith, the one going through Washington State? That was, I'm not taking that one too seriously. I think probably, I know the National Post reporter, Rahima Mohammed, probably asked her, would she consider it? And she probably said, yes, I would consider it. But I don't think it's anything that is seriously being looked at. I don't know if routes are being looked at. A lot of work is going to look into that route through Prince Rupert. There has been work going into there. And honestly, like Washington State and Oregon are not easy jurisdictions either. You would have to deal with the United States. I would say Keystone is probably closer to reality than that. But already, anyway, so, but to the point, and also, so you can get more, I mean, lots of your guests would have talked about this. At the end of the day, the only customer for crude oil is a refinery that can process that crude oil. So what we're looking for are refineries that will accept heavy oil is what we look for in Canada. And there's lots in the Gulf Coast that maybe could absorb more. And that's what Keystone would provide. But in Asia, they are, optimizing for heavy oil. They are very interested in heavy oil. And you've seen, Trans Mountain has only been existing for less than 2 years. It's already, getting close to reach capacity, such that Trans Mountain has already announced in less than 2 years that they want to expand it by 360,000 barrels, 590,000 barrel pipeline they want to expand it to up to 360. That's very significant because there is strong demand. Refineries have had a chance to test Canadian oil, and they're very interested in more. And again, all the aspects of Canada being a reliable supplier, wanting to get off Russian supply, wanting to avoid other sanctioned supplies, our long-term reserves, and the fact that we're going directly into the Pacific Basin. You don't have to go underneath South America. You don't have to go through the South China Sea. You don't have to go through the Panama Canal. You don't have to go over the Northern Sea route from Russia. It's a direct straight line to those economies, and they would love to have it. So, I feel like, again, there's a way to thread the needle. I think with the right consultation, Alberta absorbing some of that risk, getting this pipeline onto that C5 Nation Building Act, where you say, yeah, it's going to be a 2-year window. Well, all of a sudden that becomes attractive to investors. And I think if you can stack it with some Indigenous equity that is backed by the federal and Alberta governments, then you're going to have a business case.
And I'm kind of framing the last few questions as if you're a Liberal supporter who was on the side of the MOU and whatnot. But the point, I think, is that you're seeing some rays of light on economic development with energy in Canada, I think.
I see it. And I mean, just look at the stock. So, and I think people are, becoming well aware that the price of WTI has decoupled from the index of Canadian oil stocks, and that Canadian oil and gas stocks are doing better, not even relative to WTI, but relative to the S&P 500 and relative to American oil and gas companies. And it was bad luck that the oil sands came online at the exact same time as the shale revolution. Really bad luck. But shale is now peaking. Even the EIA is saying that shale is peaking. Even shale companies are saying shale is peaking. And the market now is saying shale is peaking, and we'd like to put our money somewhere else. And Canada has tremendous reserves. We have great companies. We have access to the Pacific. We have access to the American market. I'm having a hard time, finding ways why I should be sad about our situation. WTI is very low right now. But I think we all expect there's only one way, that can go, starting in either late 2026 or 2027. And then what a decade it's going to be for us.
And like you said, we take our energy security for granted, but our adversaries don't.
Yeah.
I think is one way to sum it up.
Yeah.
Which we've come to realize maybe a little more in Canada.
Well, and that goes to, we're hyper-focused on exporting and exported oil and gas. But we have to start about using our oil and gas a little bit more here. And what I mean in particular is being energy secure here. It was, from a geopolitical IR perspective, absolutely irrational to want to move to renewables, to solar and wind and batteries and EVs when China dominates those supply chains. Again, in a country so energy secure that we never even thought twice about the energy security aspects of this. But we, and even on the Chinese EVs, it's going a little out of our discussion, but we do know, and it is a threat, and our constabulary force is very concerned about this. Companies are very concerned about this. The ability of China to either interfere in the electrical system of the parts that we use, or in the EVs that you might import, and the exposure of our infrastructure, our energy infrastructure, to cyber attack and to physical attack. And we haven't worried about that in a long time. But as the world gets more dangerous, we have to start thinking about redundancy of supply, security of supply. If you can have it all in the North American continent, that's a huge advantage of not having to depend on bringing things over. And that's something that we can provide our allies. It's not just oil and gas, so those are hugely important, but copper, uranium, nuclear fuel. We offer our allies energy security, and there's not a lot of other countries that can do that.
And if we do take advantage of all that, where does it fit into the growth of the country's GDP?
I mean,
how do you frame that?
I mean, I think we all expect energy is going to get more expensive from here on in. And you're already seeing with the electricity, it's already gotten more expensive. And I think natural gas will start, to increase, certainly in North America. And oil right now is low. But again, it's too low to sustain at these prices. And so we'll see oil get more expensive too. And then in such a situation, which happens with these commodity cycles, where materials get more expensive, it's inflationary, and it can be very politically tensions. That's where you get coups and revolutions and civil wars and external wars. Anyways, for Canada, and then add in AI. and data. And that is for me a security issue.
Mhm.
The AI race is a security issue, and I promise you don't want China to win that race. And so Canada uniquely is energy abundant if we get out of our own way, can be data sovereign, can also host other countries' data. Countries that don't have energy abundance, that don't trust the United States, that don't trust China, want to have a safe haven for some of their data, and Canada can provide that. So, in terms of being able to attract business, any energy-intensive business, whether it's manufacturing or data centers, anything that needs electricity, anything that needs natural gas, and that will only grow. There's not a lot of other countries that have, again, 40 million people, second biggest country, almost these unlimited natural gas and oil reserves. If we can't, we've been dealt a full house. If we can't play our cards right, that's on us.
Yeah. And so what does success look like for you in the next few years, 3, 4, 5 years? What are you hoping for?
Great question. So for me, that I would love that oil and gas and resource extraction is not the wedge issue in Canada. I would love that your support for pipelines, oil and gas is not a red team, a blue thing. I would love that all Canadians understand that's important, and we make immigration or some other issue into the wedge issue, that elections are fought and won over. I want oil and gas and resource extraction to be normal. And so back to normal. And then I want Canada, I think we just have such an opportunity here. First, economically, domestically, to grow. There's resources, low-hanging fruit to increase our productivity, our exports, our GDP per capita. It's no question to me the easiest way to get there. And so to do that and to get on that road, to take advantage of this commodity cycle, and then finally to use our resources for good, that Canada, and maybe working with Australia in some cases, provide energy, minerals, food to the world, can be that supply, can be that swing supplier, can resist, can provide enough and provide enough buffer that the Russias and the Chinas and the OPECs, and I'll say in some cases the United States of the world, cannot manipulate and coerce, that there will be a safe and secure and reliable source of the things people need for their material well-being, and Canada can provide that for the world. And I think it would be a moral failure if we just said, no, we're just going to keep it in the ground. We're going to let people starve, and we're going to let them live in poverty, and we're going to make them be dependent on authoritarian countries instead of providing it ourselves. And so I would love to see Canadians embrace that opportunity that we can be that good guy. The best way to be the good guy is by exporting these goods to our allies.
And we'll get paid for it too.
and be rich and powerful.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing wrong with earning money.
No, in fact, I think there's an obligation. Again, this world recognizes money is strength and money is power. Mm-hmm. And to just let the bad guys have money and power is not the way that you create a better space.
Yeah. And so you study this stuff a lot. What's one myth that you would like to dispel in terms of energy policy and economic development for any policymaker that might be listening to this?
Well, I just want to say, it is the history of human civilization that humans will consume as much energy as they can afford. And I always expect people to act in their own interests. And so don't make policy that will force people to be altruistic or will make people choose to be poor, because they won't choose that in a democracy or an authoritarian country in the long term. So if you want people to consume lower carbon prices, the only solution to me is to make a lower carbon product as affordable and reliable and secure as a high carbon product. And so lean into nuclear, I guess, if I would say, if you're the environmentalist, lean into nuclear. And for everyone else, the easier and cheaper we can get our product to the world, the better I think the world will be.
And I don't think people really understand the tie between energy and technological development, where more energy is basically correlated to better human life and better technology, which is all good things.
Yeah.
Do you think that's recognized?
I don't think it's recognized. And if you say, if the solution, to, environment or emissions, who do you think is going to come up with the solution? A rich technologically advanced countries or the poor countries, that are kind of just, trying to survive. So making us poorer and making us have less and advancing a scarcity agenda, trying to make people be happy with less, small, I always say, in your work, don't make Canadian resources and energy be smaller, make it be better.
Yeah, energy abundance is good for human prosperity.
Very good. The best.
Healthcare.
The best. The perfect correlation. If you look at a chart, there's no more perfect correlation than energy use and human development.
Technology and energy are like on the same side. It's basically the same team, more or less.
I think so too.
I think that's a great place to end the conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Great. It was great to be here. Thanks for all your questions.
Anything else you want to cover? But
I think that's about it. Happy holidays to everyone.